topic to introduce to you.
Okay.
I think that it's a topic everyone will be familiar with. Cabin fever. Do you know what it is?
Oh, yeah. I know what cabin fever is. I'm sure, there must be historical significance to the meaning of what cabin fever really is. But I think in our modern day sort of perception of things, it's just this feeling of isolation, and to the point of which you feel like you can't take it anymore. Like you're so sick and tired of being stuck inside. You have cabin fever.
Well, so yeah, I like how you put that, because cabin fever is you're literally sick and tired due to the duress of that feeling of isolation, which sometimes is absolute physical confinement. Cabin fever, I think, refers more to the distinct physical entrapment, right? Because literally it's people in cabins, I think mostly over winter.
And I think that maybe just within the last year and a half, people going in and out of isolation and being on lockdown. And I know that here in the UK, people weren't allowed to walk on the street unless they had a good reason to be outdoors. You know, in retrospect, just with how I normally live my day to day and wanting to be outside and doing different things, and a lot of that was limited even while living in California, they did have like a physical effect on me where I did feel extremely run down just by being indoors, way more than usual.
There's, I think, a lot that goes into that, being out in nature. There's a certain amount of ionic detoxing, if you will, that goes on, but also just the aesthetic of changing your environment.
Yeah.
Cabin fever is also likened to stir craziness. I never really gave the phrase stir crazy a thought previously, but what does stir crazy mean? Stir means prison. So you're going prison crazy. Cabin fever is the same thing as stir craziness because you're imprisoned. Some have said that it isn't so much the confines are lacking. So you might have everything you need in your confines and not even hate the space that you're in. So if you're stuck in a cabin that has the movies that you like and the tea that you need and the sustenance, it isn't so much that those confines are lacking in some way, but the fact that you can't escape that drives this negative mental state that's directly associated to cabin fever.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to rattle off some of the common symptoms for cabin fever: claustrophobia, boredom, restlessness, anxiety, a distrust for people that are around you. Interestingly, some of the symptoms directly contrast one another. So you yourself might have one symptom and then flip-flop and have the opposite symptom. Or if you're with a housemate of some kind, you might have the exact opposite symptoms, such as sleeplessness or sleepiness. You might be exhausted, just tired all the time, or you might not be able to sleep at all. You might suffer from depression or quick mood changes into anger, outward anger, which I think of as the opposite sides of the same coin. And in very extreme cases, cabin fever can result in suicide, paranoia, mania, dangerously entering outside areas. So the instance of a terrible blizzard comes to mind, and that someone is suffering so much from the mental dis-ease
that they run out into the snowstorm.
Completely illogically, this person is aware that you shouldn't be running out into the snowstorm. You're going to get lost. You're going to freeze to death. But that there's something that compels them to do it, that they can't stop themselves. Cabin fever just in itself is not a disease. There's no prognosis for the condition, but the related symptoms can lead the sufferer into life-threatening situations. And this is, people that don't necessarily have any previous depression or mood swings could go into this physical scenario and develop these symptoms.
This is all interesting because I know that it's not specific to just being inside of a home or within a certain place. Like, you're stuck at your house. I have a feeling that what's symptomatic of this is your day-to-day routine. You could actually be leaving your house. You could actually be driving down the same street every day. You could be going to the same grocery store. Your routine is so repetitive and it goes on, the monotony of it.
Monotony.
Exactly. It goes on for such a long time that you develop these symptoms that could be akin to like a cabin fever. and you feel like you're confined and you feel like there's no escape. And certainly depression, anxiety, all of those things can result from just living in a situation or being in a situation day to day where you feel like you're stuck.
That's a wonderful observation. I started to substitute feeling isolated into everything because you're not necessarily trapped in a cabin, like you're saying. You're not necessarily in a physical confine, a physical prison that precipitates these negative cognitive issues and negative emotional states. It is the feeling of imprisonment, the feeling of being stuck, which isn't always literal and physical, but certainly can be. But there are so many other ways that being stuck needs to be investigated when you're trying to assess this nervous system kind of breakdown. So just spot on, Corinne. Some of the things that seem to alleviate stir craziness or cabin fever are interactions with nature that are brief and safe. Just having these brief interactions with nature can improve cognitive functioning. It can better your mood and your actual physical well-being as well. I want to say that those nervous system feelings and then your physical well-being, they are totally interconnected. They're very viable and connect to one another. On a societal note, I think people really often make light of conditions like this, especially when the parameters are so sprawling, because we'll say, like 30 minutes before Thanksgiving dinner, we'll go, I'm starving. And we say that we're going stir crazy when it's really just that we're having a moment of boredom.
Yeah, right.
We're not starving. We're not stir crazy. We're just mildly bored. We're waiting for our beautiful yamish dinner. But it is worth putting a little spotlight on this in this moment. We were talking in an earlier conversation about how the line is pretty wide and that a lot of people don't recognize the beginning of the line. They only recognize the end of the line, which is, I dropped dead. This is the consequence. And it's like, it'd be really nice if we had some recognizing when you've entered the line, when you've started crossing the line. That can start with a feeling of dis-ease. Disease is derived from dis-ease. You're having a sensation, a physical disease, a mental dis-ease, an emotional dis-ease, or a spiritual dis-ease, as in two words, a hyphenated word. You're not having a balanced, normal for you existence. It's disrupted. And so disease being kind of a squish squash of the hyphenated term, I think it makes it so much more clear that that's the beginning of the line. When you start to cross a line and you're not doing so great, and that there's gravity that's going to pull you to the end of the line if there isn't intervention. And sometimes we think, I'm just feeling a little bit off. I'm not saying that we shall be paranoid. And as soon as we don't feel perfect, be scared that we're just going to drop dead in 5 minutes. That's not what the range is meant to be. But I personally would like to invite a lot more empathy and being keyed in to yourself, being keyed into your loved ones, and being validating that, we don't all actually just want to complain. You know what I mean?
I do. One of the things that I'm realizing, now that I live in a foreign country and I'm looking at how students exist versus the level of expectation that's placed on students in the United States. And students in the United States are overworked and they don't get the time off that they need so their bodies can physically recover from waking up early every day, going to school, coming home and doing homework and going to bed late at night. It can have debilitating effects on kids' mental state of being. They do become depressed. They do develop anxiety.
And there are intense social ramifications. You can only be friends with people that are in school, for instance, because you do not have time or energy to have a relationship outside of school. The convenience of having someone sit near you in a classroom necessitates that friendship. If you are friends with someone, and then you change schools and you're no longer in the same school, the likelihood of maintaining that relationship is very low here. And so it's become really closed circles because people don't have the emotional availability or time availability or energy availability. And it self-validates this negative cycle that we have of only having that insular social circle, right? And that has become a very iconic American trait, US American trait, is to be like, it's us and them.
Right. Always.
It does not encourage empathy. It does not encourage newness as far as bringing people into your circle or experiencing other circles. You stay in your circle, and that is the way it is. And most people aren't thinking about it because we just have to get through the day.
Right. Parents are probably experiencing levels of anxiety and depression that their kids are experiencing because they live a cabin fever existence. They're doing the same thing day in, day out, and the society's not designed where they are allotted a break. Now, my kids here get a week vacation every 6 weeks.
Oh, I was not aware of that.
That's how the system is designed, specifically because kids need a break to rest, to recuperate, to do whatever it is that they want to do. And then they go back to school again. And the level of productivity is actually a lot higher as a result. In the United States, it's like, oh, now. And I'm going to add a voice to this just so I can make it extra annoying. Oh, now, you have to wake up every single day and you have to go to school and it's going to be weeks, months, that's what you have to do. And that's just, just going to keep piling on the work. So kids feel like they're confined and they're controlled.
There's a difference between structure and restriction. There are two major lines there. If there is no structure whatsoever, it's very hard to achieve a feeling of success or to have motivation to get ahead, right? So there's a certain amount of pressure, often external, that a person needs. Although some people are very internally driven, it's usually because they have a set of pretty clear ethics that drive them forward, or interests, just organic interests that drive them forward. But when it comes to, here's something that's new and it's uncomfortable, it almost always has to be an exterior source that's going, no, you really need to know this. You really need to experience this. You need to learn this. But then there's a line of, okay, well, there's absolutely no wiggle room for questioning what you're being taught, which is very important. When you're learning throughout life, often you realize that what you know has to morph.
Mm-hmm.
It isn't that it's not true, it was a lie necessarily, but that it's not true anymore, or that there's more to it. It's not quite as polar as it was originally thought of as. There's always a movement to knowledge, and being able to question your own opinions, assumptions, and quote, knowledge it's imperative to human development. You need some amount of structure, but when the structure is suffocating, that's not healthy.
You need a break from it.
And that for every person, they might be closer to, I do better with less external pressure because I have enough of my own to get stuff done, or that they do better with, I really like to have a regimented day. It makes me feel like I have purpose. It makes me notice that I've achieved success throughout the day and that it's recognized. But either way, I feel like recognition is a very important part of human progress, individual feelings of progress.
Oh, certainly.
And that's evaluated in a very singular way in most schools here. And I think it's really significant, though. What you're talking about, that educational model really impresses me. And I can't believe I wasn't already aware of it.
I didn't know until, of course, when we moved here and you're sitting down and you're taking in as much information that you can on how the system works and why it works the way it does. Their course load is double the amount of subjects that they're taking, but there isn't this overwhelming amount of homework that they get. They will sit in class, they'll go over the subjects, they'll do what they need to do, learn what they need to learn within that moment, and then that's it. It's reinforced the next day at school.
This is actually another topic that I have on my topic list for another episode, is how our memory functions and what kind of educational models and pacing is the best for retaining information that you've learned. And that's one of them, that you just can't be hitting the thing all day because you're actually going to lose more by hitting it that hard. And again, it varies from person to person, where reinforcing more frequently is going to assist that person, where reinforcing it more frequently with another person is going to be detrimental. There are a lot of opinions about it, and there are continual studies being done about education. But also, I think that the reason that we came around to the educational model that we're talking about is because of the idea of being stir crazy of isolation, because you're stuck in monotony, and monotony that does not breed success. And I don't mean success like achieving an amazing job that pays tons and tons of money, but that feeling of success and completeness when you've done a task that you're proud of and that you understand it, you feel like you've learned something or better. So kind of that best self achievement, I guess, is what I'm talking about, that I think a lot of us are working toward. That's why we started talking about education. If we forgot in this moment, how did we get here? It's because we were talking about how monotony is also a version of cabin fever. Now, Corinne, have you heard of Prairie Madness?
Prairie Madness. I have heard of it.
So the phrase sounds familiar to you?
Yeah.
I had never heard of it before.
It's almost like a feeling of isolation because you want to be connected to people and yet there's no one around. It's almost like I want to say it's almost relative to kind of being in an open space and it's just you and for miles, and that's all you see is what you see, but you don't see another soul in sight.
Yeah, it's the redundance of the environment again, right? But it's an open environment instead of the enclosed cabin space. You're trapped in an open expanse.
Actually, now I know why I remember this is because when I was a kid, I used to watch Little House on the Prairie. Mm-hmm. I love that show. I will always love that show. And I remember my mom bringing up the topic of losing, almost like losing a sense of stability or just feeling stable or calm when you're by yourself in the middle of nowhere, like the Ingalls are, seemingly. I mean, the center of town is right up the street, but you have the people living in isolation, so to speak, because there's nobody else around. So I think that's where I heard Prairie Madness. And then I think early settlers were dealing with the same kind of madness.
For cabin fever, I didn't see like the first time it was ever recorded scientifically or more medically that this was going on or what regions it mostly pertains to. But for Prairie Madness, it was named after a historical event in the United States, which was the Homesteading Act of 1862. The Homesteading Act of 1862 requested that farmers attempt farming in areas where there wasn't any ready community on the prairie. And each of these plots that was promised to these farmers that agreed to do it were 160 acres large. And the self-sufficiency required, it proved unattainable to many of the people that took this task on. The self-sufficiency required to be isolated on 160 acres with no town nearby was too much. And so in 1893, which is still a good leg after this initial act, there was a journalist named Eugene Vigil Smalley, and he wrote, "An alarming amount of insanity occurs in the new prairie states among farmers and their wives." So the initial accounts described people's probable mental decline with these symptoms: a disheveled appearance, crying, and suicide.
These are the products of what is essentially the pursuit of happiness, people, because what that means, essentially, looking at our Constitution, your pursuit of happiness isn't a pursuit of happiness, it's a pursuit of property as outlined in the Homestead Act.
I'm smiling. You can't hear me smiling. So those initial accounts, I was darkly tickled by, a person's disheveled appearance, because appearance was so much more uniform in that era. And so if someone was disheveled, they weren't taking care of themselves in society, especially because you engaged so little in what society there was. It was important that you looked like you were ready to go out into society. So when people showed up disheveled, it was noticeable by their peers. The range of disheveled appearance, crying, and suicide. Like that, this is what they initially took note of with this insanity that was being experienced. But other characterizing symptoms that have become understood or become known or on the books, if you will, include mental breakdowns, depression, withdrawal, changes in character and habit, violence, and insanity. Insanity and inability to be rational and to be yourself. There was a madness. And this is particularly interesting to me about the depression. It was said largely, most likely, that people were suffering from Prairie Madness because of the isolation away from society. And so those social interactions were of pivotal importance to people. But once the depression set in, people who are suffering from prairie fever would avoid social situations. So even though one of the biggest contributing factors was they needed to have social interaction, once the depression set in, they avoided social interaction. So there was a social anxiety associated with it. It's also thought, as you were saying, that the monotony of each day, the monotony of the environment itself, and then the harsh seasonal conditions contributed to the disorder. And on the plains, the seasons are really severe in temperature. So it's very, very hot during the summer and then severely cold in the winter. There's a lack of some very basic resources, key among them water and at that time, timber. So especially in the winters when it's cold, what are you going to do?
Think about the courage that it took to agree, okay, I'm going to set out, I'm going to do this, I'm going to accomplish this, I'm going to see what's out there, and I'm going to stake my claim, and I'm going to make the very best of it.
And there's a certain amount of naivety or ignorance that I think is key to most really brave behavior or a denial of some kind. And I feel like naturally part of my research for this should have been, how did the Plains original peoples live? Certainly different from how immigrants were then living on the Plains. Very, very different. I have not investigated deeply what the native peoples of America, the Plains Indians, how they lived. So another amount of studying and understanding that I need to dedicate myself to. One of the other things that was lacking, that was a really vital resource at the time, was medical care. And because there was a lack of medical care, there were certainly deaths. And then the mental state of remaining living family members suffered due to those deaths, especially in scenarios where parents had young children that died. And I'm thinking especially in the severity of winter and a lack of water, a lack of nutrition. So there are some theories even that women were more prone to suicidal behavior than men on the plains. There's been a stigma around depression and the loss of children for a long time. And it's so strange because in our textbooks, we read about how women used to die all the time in childbearing, and that lots of children died. And basically the mentality was, oh, you just go have another child. And I'm thinking to myself, yeah, I'm pretty sure that the women were not great with it.
Yeah.
Even the women that had like 10 children, and they paid less and less attention to each child as they went, because I've had friends that are part of families that, 6+ children. And there was a feeling of not being an individual, of not being important, of not getting enough of their parents' affection and time. And yes, I can understand intellectually that more children per family at some point in history was necessitated. If you are working land to be able to produce enough food, and then also, if you're considering, I'm going to lose some of these children, because statistically speaking, you just know that some of them are going to die. So I better have as many as I can. And then also, there was no reproductive choice for a very long time that was readily available or normalized. And so just having so many kids and suffering so many deaths in your life, that I don't see how that's emotionally something you could recuperate from, especially when in society you weren't even supposed to talk about it. You couldn't be emotional about it. You just had to keep going, keep going, keep going. One of the things, though, in one of the articles that I read was, not only did it seem more likely that a woman would commit suicide than a man, but that it was done in an exhibition style. And I wonder, what does that mean exactly, an exhibition style? It's like they never put their dirty laundry out to air and until they had crossed that line, that very last line that I keep describing.
I've never heard of that, an exhibition style suicide. I mean, you can guess just by the term exhibition, but that you hang yourself where people are going to find you. But if you're in the middle of nowhere, I mean, what does that mean? It's all very sad. And you know what? It really boils down to the expectations of others as well.
It's a really difficult aspect of examining something that is both personal and societally related, is that you've taken into your personal self a lot of things that are on the outside. And there are a lot of interconnective topics that this can naturally branch out into. A lot of self-help kind of quotes are very isolating. Self-help quotes are like, what that person thinks of you has nothing to do with you. Do what you're going to do anyway. What people think of you and how they see you is unimportant. Do what you want anyway. Those kind of things. Those are bits of advice that are very isolating, that are meant to be empowering. But when you're examining this topic, people were very self-sufficient, much more self-sufficient than we are now, being able to obtain the needed natural resources and go it alone. And yet, that sensation of being other, being separate, being lonely, being isolated, even if it is not physical, is still pervasive right now. And I would say specifically because I am in US American society, that I feel it quite a lot, that I see in political endeavors and in marketing that there's this, be the smart one, do this, be the better one, do that, be on top, be this.
But why do that? Because somebody else is telling you to.
It's so insidious. Like I said, when you're raised in a society or an intimate culture, like how many years later did it take you to realize something about your family, about your household that you're like, oh yeah, nobody else was doing that. But I thought silently in the back of my head that everyone did that. So there's a lot of that. There's a lot of subconscious stuff, information. Lots of it is subconscious communication and subconscious memory building and knowledge building. And then when it comes to this kind of stuff where there's a very intricate web of societal weaving and how every individual and every household weaves into that is really unique too. And it's interesting to see this craziness, these fevers and these syndromes through different regions and different eras. Okay, so I want to say that some of the solutions to this phenomenon, this disorder, is that a lot of the people that came out and were suffering mentally had to go back to a cityscape. They had to go back to where there was more people, and it alleviated all the issues. So once again, people could have been mentally, emotionally stable going into the scenario and had that feeling of sanity just cut up into ribbons until they could remove themselves from the scenario that made them feel isolated. And then actually once in the 20th century, the telephone and the automobile became more common. Accounts of the disorder pretty much disappeared, which leads me to, have you ever heard of kayak angst?
Kayak angst. I haven't heard of it. Kayak angst. I mean, you can guess, but having to do with is it not a fear, or is it like a trepidation of going into a kayak for traveling, open ocean, open water? It's a guess.
That's a great guess. So kayak angst is specifically a name of a disorder that's similar to the disorders we've been discussing, that is attributed to seal hunters in Greenland. So it's a lot more regionally specific. It's much more culturally specific because these hunting kayaks are one-man kayaks. Mm-hmm. So it's men that are experiencing it, because in the Greenland Inuit cultures, largely it's the men that are hunting. So where we're finding in some of the other disorders that women were suffering more, in this instance, we're not going to find accounts of any female sufferers because they're not in the isolating scenario. But it's a one-man boat out on open water, hunting a very dangerous species in this kind of scenario. So there is some idea that there's a tie to the frequent and repetitive life and death position that the hunters are in. But also there's this physical aloneness that happens out in the open water, where people who suffer from the disorder will experience a feeling of panic, a feeling of coldness, a feeling of anxiety. They might suffer hallucinations. And it can happen when the conditions out on the water are very still and there's fog, and it makes it very difficult to distinguish the horizon, so from the air, from the water, and you just feel like you're kind of floating out in space, which is similar to the prairie fever, mm-hmm. where you're in this open space. And I actually wonder if there is another disorder associated with astronauts. Oh, so I was saying that it can happen when the water is very still and it gets disorienting because the horizon is indistinguishable. Or it can also happen in adverse weather, which makes sense in a different way.
Mm-hmm. It makes sense.
You're in physical danger, but then that kind of void, that feeling of the void, I would imagine that it'd be a different anxiety associated with each of those, but they're both attributed to kayak angst. And it's considered a culture-bound syndrome because it's just these particular Inuit seal hunters that suffer from this exact syndrome. But it's still super, super similar to the other diseases that we've talked about, where it's not an actual disease that's contagious. It's attributed to that specific physical scenario, plus other external difficulties that could be life-threatening, but become very psychological. The only thing that's different about this is I didn't read any accounts of hallucination associated with the prairie fever or the cabin fever, although paranoia is still a kind of hallucination.
I think that it is. I think it's beginnings of what you're sensing it.
Mhm.
And then with hallucination, you're actually seeing it.
Exactly. So if you're sensing something that's not going on, that is like a dark fantasy, versus now you're seeing this unreal dark fantasy. But I think they're pretty close together as far as neurological ailments go. And one of the only things that seems to help alleviate kayak angst is either returning to land or running into another person on the water and feeling retethered to reality. And it seems to break that spiral of panic.
I wonder if because I'm thinking with the kayak angst and with the prairie fever, the two of them are similar in that, being in those locations is everything to do with like survival. And if you're not managing your situation correctly, then it's less likely that you'll survive.
The stakes are very high. Your life is at stake.
Yeah. So hunting for food and providing for the family and being success, I think other anxieties coming home with your intended catch. And I don't even think it's just feeding your family. I think it's feeding other community members too, other people that are in your tribe.
I believe so.
Yeah. So there's a lot of stress with that. I think with prairie fever, maybe the anxiety is success. I'm successful at what I do. I've done it. I've survived, and I have a lot to show for the work that I've put in. It's funny because it's very simple, but it's still one of those little grains that exist in our minds of showing people, look, I've done it. And when you feel like you're not succeeding, then of course you feel like you're developing anxiety. And the reality is sometimes people really don't care. Just let it go, just by today's standards. But yeah.
Today's standards are really different because there's something to be said about manual labor and the physical productivity that can be literally measured. When it comes to life experience that isn't validated by an external source, you can only do internal validation of, I did enough today. I grew emotionally today. I grew
knowledge today. Lots of times, unless you can commodify that, there's not going to be any validation for you. And then other times things are commodified that are utterly useless, or that it's not useful to one person, but it is the bee's knees to another person. I have one more.
Have you ever heard of piblokto?
How do you spell it?
P like Peter, I, B like boy, L-O-K, T like Tom, O. Piblokto.
Piblokto. No, I have never heard of that.
Thank goodness. Yeah. My goal is to surprise you. Well, it's also known as Arctic hysteria.
Oh, gosh.
And it specifically only occurs among the people living in the Arctic Circle. So again, this is going to be a much smaller cultural experience. It'll be a culture-bound syndrome as compared to the cabin fever and the prairie fever. Cabin fever, I think, is the most probably understood and most experienced disorder worldwide. Like prairie fever is pretty, as in the name, pretty specific.
Yeah.
So you're not going to experience that if you live in other weather areas, other geographic locations. And with the kayak angst, you have to be a hunter of seals in a one-man kayak to experience it. And then with piblokto, you have to be in the Arctic Circle. Symptoms unique to the disorder are that sufferers perform dangerous actions and then have amnesia of the occurrences. Largely, this is a situation that is only occurring with Inuit women. And in Western cultures, I think it's just kind of an off the cuff. There's probably an issue with people not getting enough sun. So maybe this is a seasonal affective disorder spinoff. But either way, the piblokto itself describes an abrupt dissociative episode that includes the following phases: social withdrawal, excitement or perhaps convulsions, and then stupor, and then the recovery period with the amnesia. There was a doctor of medicine who passed away in 2012, I believe. His name was Wen-Xing Seng. He wrote a book called A Handbook of Cultural Psychiatry. And he wrote of an account of a 30-year-old woman living within the Inuit culture in the Arctic Circle that started having the syndrome annually. In one of the scenarios, she was violent, was assaulting externally, and then ultimately tried to hurt herself, didn't remember afterward. And then in another scenario, fled out into the wilderness, tearing off her clothes and then not remembering it. And these bursts were only 15 minutes, maybe 30 minutes. And they only endured for a short period of time, but they were very, very intense. And rather than understanding the piblokto as a strange cultural phenomenon, some critical scholars now understand it to be an expression of trauma of colonial violence, largely including rape of the women of the Inuit culture. I was really pleased to read this because it's not making it sound like, oh, physical estrangement, oh, sunshine, oh, food. It's like, no, a culture was broken into and literally raped. And these women were under such a unique kind of distress with all of these things coming together and creating a mental break.
It makes perfect sense because it could even be an event that happened and some time passes and, women are carrying on, but the story is living with them. And I think that can have a significant effect on somebody's mind or their psyche, that the possibility exists that this could happen to me. It could happen again.
But so this distress of being trapped, being stuck in a scenario that has harmed you or could stand to harm you, leading to a mental break where you're not behaving like yourself, having hallucinations, or losing a sense of logic, spinning out. All of these symptoms can happen under different situations of duress. But to read these accounts of similar fevers and really have the symptoms be very similar, I thought was incredibly valid. And that it was something that was really worth a conversation following experience with an epidemic. And how does society react, and how does a culture react, and how does an individual react, and where is the information coming from, and how much sense can we make of it as individuals, and that it's going to cause an interruption of our cognitive thinking. Actually, I have a note about the current experience with quarantining that most of us have experienced. A much more recent article on it said that the isolation of quarantining can result in post-traumatic stress, confusion, and anger. And according to a rapid review published in The Lancet in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, stressors include longer quarantine duration, infection fears, frustration, boredom, inadequate supplies, inadequate information, financial loss, and stigma. Again, this is a personal and societal issue of fear of not having your needs met, not knowing what is going to happen to you, not knowing the outcome of things, and then having a spin out of fear and that you can't validate what your system of truth and your system of success is. You no longer have those systematic thumbs up, and that you can check the box that you're doing things right and that you're recognized for being in the right. All of that is erased. You're on your own. You're in your home, hopefully, if you have a home. That's the other thing, is this isn't even taking into account people that didn't have a safe space to be in, which is a huge topic. Harvard put out a report that stated that animals in isolation suffer brain shrinkage, and that similarly, humans that feel isolated can suffer cognitive decline. In the elderly, isolation is correlated with an expedited onset of dementia. I need to say in this moment that I'm not bad-mouthing the idea that people should isolate at any given time in their lives. If you have an emotional crisis and you need to isolate yourself, you have the right to do that. That might be just what you need. If there is an epidemic scenario, that's going back to the cabin fever topic. One of the things about going stir crazy is that you don't care. You just want to get out. If there's a very real life-threatening scenario, which logically means you need to stay behind closed doors, that's one thing, versus a paranoia of I need to stay behind these closed doors because I'm not safe. So again, there's a line at one end and there's a line at the other, and the healthy space is in between. And that it's going to be different for every individual. What that healthy space in between is going to make the most sense for them. And that being able to adhere to that system of safety for yourself is not self-centered in a you're a bad citizen, you're a bad person way. You can cross the line and be an a-hole for sure. But to try to be as aware of your personal needs and try to take into consideration that there are other people that have needs and they might be a little different. And to try to take that into account in a way that doesn't become detrimental to you. And I think on that note, I just want to say that I feel like that's been bred into me as a female to be very concerned with everyone else's well-being and to push my comfort level up to the red point on the line and then go, oh shit, I'm either going to have a total mental breakdown or I'm physically going to be attacked. I'm in an unsafe scenario. And it's like we have to get right up to it until it almost burns us or it is burning us to be validated that we need to pull out of that and save ourselves. And so I feel like that line needs to be repainted for me. I've been progressively over the last several years trying to repaint that line of when is the onset of symptoms of dis-ease? Can I, in an internal way, validate it? Can I get it validated on the outside? And usually the answer is no, I can't get it validated on the outside. I've been sexually assaulted, could not get that validated on the outside, that even counted as an assault. Was it bad enough to be considered assault? Isn't assault such a strong word? Oh, did it happen at all? And then as we talked about earlier, that there's a paranoid level of, I can't go out into the world is dangerous. And then there's a very healthy level of, I'm not going to go out into the world today because I'm feeling like I might break. I might have a mental break. That doesn't make you a weirdo. That makes you a human. If you're going to cry or appear disheveled in public, yes, it's a different time period than when we were talking about Prairie Madness, but those are indicators to a degree. If you feel like you can't go out into the world, you don't want to care about your appearance, you don't care if you've washed your hair, you don't care. If you stop caring, something's wrong. Mm-hmm. And it's not that you have to adhere to certain societal forms of this is how you show you care. And I'm going to reiterate that as a woman, I have been taught to just show up for everybody else's system of comfort. Show up for everyone else's validation. Validate those other human beings. Validate those children. Validate those other women. Validate those men. If you don't do that, then you're invalidating. And it's so polarized that if you say, this is what I need for my safety, that it's also like, oh, well, then you don't care about anyone else.
It's funny, but just looking back in generations of women that, unfortunately, here you are existing as a mother, as, and I'm in my own life existing as a mother, and you're reaching those breaking points and you're turning to other women who've experienced it themselves. But rather than say, I understand what you're doing, you need a break. There needs to be more acknowledgement of women taking a break from this day-to-day, or rather, take that word back, more or less a validation of what other people are doing. And more of that and less of, well, I lived through it and so should you. Well, that's what my life was like. And so that's just the way it is. Oh, well, you don't know what I've been through, and that's just what you have to deal with. And I feel that comes from more women to other women than anything.
I can echo that experience in my own life, especially with somewhat older women. It's kind of this, it's just how things are. Work within the system that's been given to you. And my argument would always be, this system is not working and I want to do something to change it. And they're like, nope.
Yep.
Especially when I worked in an environment that was run by men. Mm-hmm. And women that had gotten very friendly with the men and were well regarded amongst the men, and me coming in and going, this is not time efficient. They're not respecting me. It's a waste of my time, but my time didn't matter. And I was always in these situations, the youngest female. There's something about being younger where you come in and go, we need to change the system. And I understand that could be a frustration, that things are constantly outmoded. And to be the bearer of this, I think that this is outmoded. We can do better. But also putting that aside and going, okay, but my time is being wasted. I am not being validated. Everyone else is. And to be told as a woman, in so many ways with family members and in the workplace, like your experience is second to everything else because you can bear it, just bear it. And then when you get old enough, you get to be a crotchety old witch that isn't obligated to be polite to other people. And I'm like, how is it that women are obligated to be polite and smiley to everyone up until they're a crotchety old thing? Mm-hmm. And then it's like, oh, you just have to forgive grandma because, she's from a different time. I don't want to be that person that's only respected or forgiven because I reached a certain telltale age.
There needs to be more of an acknowledgement of the fact that women do reach a breaking point and they need the support of other females. And it does happen, and when it does happen, it really stands out because it doesn't happen enough. There needs to be less of, well, I experienced that, so therefore you should too. It's just the way that it is. And it does come from older women. When I was a new mom and my husband was going to work every day and we had one car and he was using it. And here I was living in a new town, in a new region of a state that I was still trying to figure out, with no friends, no family, and no transportation. And it's like, I didn't get any support. It was just like, that's just the way it is. So, I did that. So, it was what it was. And I would never wish that on another female. And if another female is experiencing that, I will be there for her. And I will not tell her things like, oh, well, I experienced that. Just hang in there. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to be that person, because that's the person that's inflicting pain. It's inflicting sadness. And it's really just overall kind of like a sense of injustice. We're trying to get out of this hole that we're in as women.
I have a similar experience that you have as far as being truly vulnerable with other women. It's a rarity. There are very few people that I feel like I can have a conversation with and have them not think less of me. If I expose that I am vulnerable or hurting. And I think especially as an actor who has to have a sort of public personality as well, have a public profile, and have, even at a very small level, some sort of icon status, an iconic status. Even as an indie actor, I'm saying that this exists. I'm not saying I am an icon, I am a star, but there is a portion of that happening for anyone that puts themselves out there, that there's a persona and that there's a lot of judgment, and that people want to believe that you aren't quite human, that you won't have human weaknesses, and that your character is you somehow. It's a part of being an actor. And I feel like I'm more truthful as an actor in most scenarios than I am in my day-to-day life, where, I'm having to kind of wear a mask and only take it down when I'm home alone and safe. And meanwhile, when you're in front of the camera or you're giving a character you're trying to be as raw and as truthful as possible. And that's not the grace of everyday life. I feel like there's a lot of being very careful what you say, how you say it, and not to be vulnerable again, because it's like people want to believe that you're going to make it as an actor and that they're going to associate with you because it's a networking thing. And if you prove to be an imperfect specimen, that it's like you get thrown off the conveyor belt. Oh, she's difficult. She has emotions. Well, so do you. Everybody does. And that also, I have taken to questioning anything that's associated with the phrase, that's just how things are, especially ways that I just subconsciously am as far as what my morals or my ethics or my behaviors are because of how I was raised. You just kind of assume that that's just how the world is. That's just how things work. That's just how things are. Anytime I now find that sensation or those actual words coming to the surface, I go, that needs examining, because nothing just is how it is. I forget what it was. I think I was watching a documentary, but maybe it was a meme, but these words stuck with me, that if you ask why something is happening, but you ask why, I think it was 6 layers deep, that's when you actually start to get to the root of a concern. And that is truly why we named the show By the Roots, because you have to ask that many questions of yourself and those around you to start to actually, not just topically, address anything. You can't just put a Band-Aid on a festering wound. You can't leave something embedded in a wound either, even if it looks healthy and covered up, because things take a while to fester. But that's true with most of these disorders that we just talked about today. It's a length of time that just eats away at a person, with the exception of the kayak angst, which is a very short timeline of you go out into the kayak and then you could experience these symptoms. All the other symptoms, it's insidious, it takes time. You're okay up until a breaking point. So at what point were you really starting not to be okay? Was it when you weren't brushing your teeth? Was it when you weren't buttoning all the buttons correctly? Or was it only the moment that you got the rope and went out to the oak tree?
I wonder how we can recognize when that is.
Well, and that's a sticky topic because I do have a history of suicidality and having a number of loved ones in my life that have committed suicide. And so that is the number one topic that comes to mind for me with any mental disorder, is that ultimately there can be a loss of life. And that can be an internal, you inflict violence on yourself and you lose your life, or you can be violent externally and put someone else's life at risk. And the thing is I don't ever want to take someone too seriously too soon, because I don't want them to feel like they can't talk to me about things that are bothering them without me going, I'm worried that you're going to kill yourself. That'll make them feel like they can't talk to me if they aren't feeling suicidal. But my worry is always, but if I don't take it seriously enough, they could be dead. If I don't take what's going on with them seriously enough. I had a conversation with a woman once, one of those women that we were discussing, the slightly older woman that told me to just make the men happy, just make those men happy. They know what they're doing. Nicole, you don't, comparatively, do you know what you're doing? I'm like, yes, I do know what I'm doing, actually. And she said, suicide is all that some people have left. And she just said it so like greeting card style, like, yeah, people just need to commit suicide sometimes because that's the only power they have. And I was like, do you even hear what you're saying? If the only power that you feel like you have left in your life is to not live anymore, it means there are other things going on. And some of those things are not just going to be that individual's mental illness, but why are they having this mental illness, this mental breakdown? All of these scenarios that we've talked about today had very specific criteria, creating the sensation of loneliness and invalidation and fear. I just want to say a few words that I feel like are just good words to ponder that are part of this topic. Marooned, stranded, abandoned, stuck, helpless, solitary, lonely, outlying, desolate, bleak, friendless. If you feel that you have no true friends that you can be yourself with, if you cannot communicate what's going on inside of you, there's a sense of isolation. And if there's one thing I've learned from these discussion topics of cabin fever, prairie fever, kayak angst, and piblokto, it's that in every case, an impossible to bear degree of self-sufficiency afflicted the sufferers. If you can no longer maintain self-sufficiency in some way, shape, or form, and you find yourself in emotional, mental, physical distress over it, that is significant. And there might not be a name for that specific dis-ease that you are experiencing. And then that does not mean that it doesn't exist. Just because there isn't a word for your experience, is there a word for how sweet babies smell? I don't think that there is a specific word for that. It is a real thing. I've sniffed enough babies to know that that is a real thing. And I have found again and again in life that there isn't a perfect collection of words or one specific word that can describe a unique experience. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist or that you aren't going to be affected by it. Children are aware of a lot more than they can communicate for a very long time. And that doesn't stop. We're just more aware of the fact that children experience it. Adults experience things all the livelong day. And at the end of the day, don't always have words for it or can't understand the significance of those experiences in that day. They can't go, I know how this is going to affect me. In 10 years, I'll this, or I'll think that, or I'll feel this, or I'll avoid this kind of person. We don't know. And it's okay that we don't know. It's interesting to try to understand it and to have studies that go over the long-term effects of certain things, but we're not always going to have that privilege. And circling back to the strength of routine, one of the strengths as a human being, not based on routineness, is being able to accept that we don't know everything. And I say that as being important to this topic because there's an element of unknown in these deep, deep fears that affected the psychology of the sufferers of these disorders. A deep fear of a losing of their life, a losing of their culture, or that it was actually happening, that they were out of touch. And so were they a part of culture anymore? Were they in these relationships anymore because they were feeling so estranged? One of the things that I forgot to mention when we were talking about prairie fever is that a lot of the people that ended up farming out on the prairie due to the Farming Act that I mentioned before is that it was a multilingual scenario. There wasn't a unified language for all of these families. So even when they went into town to obtain goods or sell goods, they were not unified by a language. So the feeling of not being a part of the whole was still there and perpetuated by that. And so then at that point, it becomes a question of, well, your language is valid, but you can't use it in this scenario. So how do we diplomatically decide what the right commonality is? How do you decide without making it seem like what you already come to the table with isn't completely invalid? Because that's that binary thinking that I'm talking about as being very dangerous, that I think participates heavily in these psychologically harming scenarios, is that we go, well, everything that you know how to do, that you know how to say, the way that you think, that's all invalidated. Let's do this now. There's an in-between where we can go, okay, what you know is very valid. We just can't apply it here. And it's very important that we can apply ourselves here right now to connect to one another. Thinking that things are either right or wrong only is going to cause more of these syndromes, more of these diseases in the history books, in the psychiatric journals. Having this binary thinking that things are either right or wrong is going to do nothing but harm ourselves and harm others. Being able to have an open conversation with another human being without fear of attack is incredibly important.
I think the key word in all of this is isolation. And listening to you talk has brought up so much as far as how sensitive we are to being isolated. If it's diseases can isolate us, a physical condition can isolate us from others,
Because it's othering. I want to reiterate, I know it sounds like it can't be associated, but as a female actor and watching documentaries like Gina Davis's This Changes Everything, it's fake. That idea of othering half of the globe's populace, women, they're other. Humans can do that. They can create life scenarios where they truly believe that that core, the strong core of what a populace is this one thing. And it's not.
Just one thing I wanted to mention. I'm just thinking of children who are trying to find their way and who feel really no sense of belonging, especially when they're not accepted for who they are. As soon as I think that when we recognize that point of when do we need to intervene is when these symptoms start. And whether a person realizes it or not. But the intervention is just, it's as subtle as just maybe just being there. You okay? Because I kind of worry about you a little bit, I've been watching you. Just want you to know that I'm here for you and I love you very much. You can tell me anything.
I do like to use the phrase, I've been watching you. Yeah. I think that might be where the phrase holding space comes from. When somebody doesn't know the exact needs that you have, but they want you to know that they're using some of their mental and emotional space for you. And that even at an intellectual level, that hopefully is helpful to know. I see you're suffering. I don't know what to do for you. Maybe I can't actually do anything for you, but I just want you to know that I'm holding that space. I'm going through a system of effort in my own life that's dedicated to you. I think that's something, that's almost holy. That's a holy way of treating other humans. Cabin fever. Little House on the Prairie started all of this.
What a trip. Talking about all this stuff. When you're fully engaged in the winding path of of all of it. It really is just fascinating.
The causality and the attributing factors, and that it's never one thing. And we only really know about the last straw, but guaranteed there were always other straws.
Thanks for tuning in to By the Roots with hosts Nicole Berry and Corinne Madors. Music by Mim Paquin.